Hi, everybody, and welcome. Thank you to Sarah Milstein for joining me today for the Reimagining Work and Life Through Crisis Expert Insights series. You'll see when I read Sarah's amazing biography why I invited her to visit with me today, because she is somebody with a vast amount of experience, a career spanning technology and media. And through this career, Sarah has gained deep expertise in working with remote colleagues, distributed teams, and satellite offices. Currently, Sarah is the Senior Director of Engineering at MailChimp and Site Director for the company's startup Brooklyn office. Previously, she was the Head of Sales and Marketing for 18F, a young tech consultancy within the federal government. And before that, she was CEO and co-founder of Lean Startup Productions, a successful media startup, and a co-author of The Twitter Book, a popular guide. She holds an MBA from UC Berkeley's Haas School of Business and a BA from Rutgers University, yay, New Jersey. And she splits her time between New York and San Francisco. And I love this bonus fact about Sarah. She was the 21st user of Twitter, which is very impressive. And also, Sarah is the master of the working on her treadmill. I asked her to do this to show us all how we could be inspired to do work and also stay healthy, which I think is great. And the reason I asked Sarah to join me today is in February, she wrote this amazing article that I referenced in one of the Insight series, I think it was last Tuesday, called Remote Work Insights You've Never Heard Before, that I loved so much. I think I wrote her an email that said something like, yes, Sarah, yes, Sarah, yes, Sarah. Oh my God, like it was that good. And I couldn't really think of a better person to address the burning question I'm hearing from managers, especially the ones that have never done this before, who've been thrown in the remote and flexible work deep end. How do you do this? How do you trust people that they're getting their jobs done? How do you engage with them? And I know that Sarah has done, not only has a tremendous amount of experience in this area, but also has done a lot of thinking in how to explain her experience to other leaders. So Sarah, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, Kelly, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Oh, well, let's just start with your wonderful piece in Medium. You know, you have learned so much leading remote and distributed teams over the years. And, you know, when you build that foundation of shared leadership that is so critical for flexible and remote work, one of the points you mentioned was, and I love this, is whether you come into a situation assuming trust or if you need people to earn trust. Can you talk about why that is so important to understand your perspective and what you believe the way you need to be would look like?
Yeah. So first of all, let's just make sure we've got a baseline understanding about trust. There's quite a lot of research that shows that high trust teams are most effective and productive, and they're also the ones where people are most satisfied working. The trust is a really important element of a good, effective workplace. The traditional workplace model is based on the idea that you earn trust in part by seeing the other people near you doing work, that they're sitting or standing near you and they're actually doing something that you can recognize as work, and you build up an understanding that they are working and you can trust that they'll do things. But in fact, most of the work we do, you can't see what people are doing anyway. Like they're on a computer. When I say most of the work we do, I mean in workplaces that are office-based, primarily, that are where people are primarily working on some kind of a device, and that's the input and the output is primarily device-based. In those cases, most of the time you can't see the work they're doing anyway. The output of what they're doing is something digital, and that's what you look at to see if they're getting their work done. But the vestige of how we build trust is still there. The sense that being able to see somebody or being able to ask them quickly or share an insight with them, that all feels like it builds trust for a lot of people. But not for everybody. So there's some research that shows that, as you said, some people assume trust in other folks. You start at a high level of trust, and people can build it up, but you assume that they're trustworthy and that they're trusting you. And other people start at it's more like a zero, and people have to earn their trust and build up. Now, there's some research that says that that's innate, and I tend to think things that are thought to be innate are things you could emulate anyway. So even if it's true that that's innate, in a distributed workplace, you need to assume some trust in folks in order for everybody to stay sane and actually focus on the things you need to do rather than proving things to each other. And most of the time, as I said before, the work that you're doing is digital in effect anyway. So you can look at the output of people's work rather than the artifact of their showing up to determine whether they're working and how much trust you can put in them.
So to that end, that's interesting. So what are some of the ways that you gauge performance digitally with your people? Because I know that's one of the the truth of the matter is, in most of these organizations, there wasn't a great way of measuring performance before. They really was a default to FaceTime. And now you're being forced to face the fact that you have to sort of figure out ways to gauge productivity. And what are some of the ways that you look at that with your teams?
Yeah. Well, certainly, it depends on the kind of work. Sometimes there is a quantitative aspect to it where you can see, especially I think for more junior people, but again, it depends on the kind of work. Are they producing the number of things? Are they writing the reports that need to be written this month if that's their job? Are they shipping the lines of code? Are they designing interfaces? There are actual things that somebody's creating that you have some shared sense of what's the cadence on which that should be happening, and there's some number you can count. But there's also more qualitative things. How are they communicating? Are they contributing to meetings in a way that make the meetings more productive, that help their colleagues level up and get more things done? When they do collaborate on things, are they able to surface that so that other people can model it, and so that people are aware of connections that are happening when you can't see each other talking? And so I think it's probably thinking about a slightly more sophisticated communication skills, or a more sophisticated way of measuring them, and just being aware of people's ability to communicate with each other proactively and effectively, which is something we need in workplaces no matter what the setup, but it's particularly important in a distributed team.
So that's the collaboration and coordination that becomes really important, not just with the manager doing all the work, but with managers, teams, and employees working together, I would imagine, correct?
Yeah, exactly. To think again, in any workplace, you want some balance of that. And it might be that the manager is doing a little bit more of that, but you would still want that from employees in any workplace. And we just need a little bit more intention around it in a distributed setting. And it's something you want to look for your team members to do and reward them when they're doing it and encourage them to do more when it's needed.
Okay, so you and I have talked about this, how when all this first happened, there was a lot of advice going out to managers about these very sort of more sophisticated, higher level platforms that managers could use to communicate. And I got nervous that it was asking too much of managers to adopt these things very quickly. So, but I think we're 2 months into this now, and I do think maybe they've gotten enough of their grounding in maybe the existing technology they had that perhaps they could level up a little bit and maybe try some of these more advanced collaboration tools. What are some of the tools that you find are particularly helpful in your management of a distributed remote team?
Well, again, it depends on the team and the nature of what the team is doing, but usually baseline for any team is some version of corporate chat. So that could be Slack, or Microsoft has an equivalent version, and there are some other like enterprise kinds of packages. Slack is probably the most common these days, and some kind of video software, whether that's Zoom or Skype or something that's baked into Google, whatever suite of tools you're using. That combination of things, I think, not only makes for the most effective distributed work, but they're really valuable tools when you're working in person too. And I want to be clear, there, especially the something like chat, it's not a one-size-fits-all thing. You have to figure out how to use it effectively for your teams. One thing that people talk about sometimes is like when email first came on the scene, there weren't a lot of protocols yet about like, when do you reply all? When do you BCC people? When do you attach things? Do you thread forever? Do you fork threads? Are you supposed to respond to it right away? Or can it wait a week? Or is it a day? What are the norms around communication? And I think what you'll find now is that there's some global norms, and then also every company has their own culture about how do we use email? How do we use any kinds of tools? How do we use comments in a Word or a Google Doc? And something like Slack or other chat software is the same. There are some global norms, but it's still early days. And what's really important is that you figure out and test some ideas with your company to figure out what's important and how to use them. How are you going to use them so that it feels additive instead of like just a burden, another thing you have to pay attention to.
And I like that you're saying it really is something you have to experiment with and see how it works and keep iterating on it and recalibrating it until it works for you. That's great. So this leads to my next question around engagement. So I do hear one of the main challenges and concerns, especially for leaders who haven't had a lot of experience leading a remote or flexible team, is how do you engage your direct reports? I keep coming back to this water cooler. How do I replicate the water cooler? And, and when I'm trying to understand what they're saying when they say that, because they say it a lot. And I think it really is that informal exchange of just ideas and just seeing each other. The engagement piece, I think does challenge people. Like, what does that look like and how do you make that happen?
Yeah. I have the same experience you do in the sense that I hear people say that a lot. And when I ask what they mean by it,
I know.
There's not always an actual answer, but I have the same sense you do, that there's a feeling of connecting.
Yes.
And I think what's true in person is that some of your team members are going to have a high desire to connect and some are not. And that's easy to hide in person. Like if you're showing up at the meetings, but you're not that engaged, people might know, but you're doing the thing of showing up. If it's fully distributed and you're pretty quiet in Slack, for example, and you show up at the meetings, people might still feel like you're not really there. And that may be fine for an individual, but for a manager feeling like, oh, is my team here? That can be could have kind of an amplified feel. So I think the first thing is like, keep in mind, not everybody may need the thing that you need or that you are assuming they do. But probably a lot of people do. They want to have some kind of connection. A good thing to do is to ask, right? Is to try to get in the weeds with people and find out, does it feel to you like there's some piece of our connection of informal conversation or of social connection that we're missing? And if there is, let's brainstorm about what we can do, what we can try. And I'm going back to what you said before, experimentation is probably the most important thing. That you want to come up with a couple of ideas, things to try, but say we're going to try this for 3 weeks or whatever. We're going to do it 3 times or 3 months, depends on what the thing is. And at that point in time, we're going to put a date in the calendar and talk about, did it work? Did it meet our need? If we thought it was going to help us feel more connected, did it do that? Or did it just start to feel like another meeting we had to have, or a different channel we had to pay attention to, or something that nobody participated in and we need to try something else? And that's even with something that's working, that you've agreed, let's do this. You probably need to check in every 6, 9, 12 months, because these kinds of tools change and people's usage of them changes. And if other teams are changing their usage, you may wind up with a different context in which you're working and you need to keep adapting.
So can you share some things that you've done with your teams? I'm just curious because I know you've done some cool things. I just wonder what those are.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I can give a couple of examples. So on that point of engagement, I'm the site director for MailChimp's Brooklyn office. The company is based in Atlanta and the office in Brooklyn is just a couple of years old. We've got about 70 people here. And when we have an in-person office and when we're there, we have a bunch of ways that people tend to connect. We have a series of lunches and other kinds of internal meetups that really keep people connected. And we had tried to replicate some of that in Zoom. And it's like, okay. But it was starting to feel to me like we continue to hire during this period. So there's new people. All the old people are on different teams, so they don't see each other. And it was starting to feel like things were fraying a little bit without my even being able to tell you what that is. So if you asking myself the question that I wish people could answer better, I didn't have a great answer other than to say it felt a little bit like we were not as connected to each other. And I brought that to the group of Brooklyn managers. All the managers in Brooklyn here meet occasionally, and asked if it felt that way to them and their teams, and they said yes. And we did some brainstorming and came up with some things to try, including we have in one of our Slack channels a weekly thread of photos from the weekend.
Oh,
I usually
fun.
start it off and I say, what's the 10th picture back? And what is this a picture of? And that's been really fun. We've been doing it just in the last month or so. But somebody noted that if we put it all in a thread, it's really hard to have a conversation off of it, because each one, there's just photos following each other. And sometimes they spark cool connections. So a really little thing we're doing is, instead of threading all of those messages in Slack so they're stacked underneath each other, we're posting them separately so people can have conversations off of each photo. And we did that this week, and it was really lively. So we'll see that. Maybe in another month we don't need that, or doesn't feel like that's the connection to have. But right now, it feels really nice. We agreed to do, Zoom has a feature where it lets you have breakout rooms. So if you've got, say, 30 people in your Slack, you can kind of push a button and assign everybody to subgroups of 3 or 4 people, and for any length of time. And we thought, you know, our lunches used to be like we'd have a speaker at lunch, and then everybody would break into little groups and chat for a while. And when we just do the Zoom of 30 people, we don't have the chance for those informal conversations. But the breakout rooms let us do that. So we started playing with those for part of the lunch meetings that we're having. And last week it was really fun, and it's a really lightweight way. Nobody has to plan anything other than to be at lunch. And you know, it turned out to have some spontaneity to it. That's exactly the sort of thing we felt like we were missing.
Oh, that's great. That's great. So is that's through Slack? It's the coordination of Slack and Zoom at the same time?
So the first thing I mentioned, the photos are through Slack.
Okay.
And the breakout rooms are in Zoom.
In Zoom,
the feature you can enable in Zoom.
In Zoom.
As a host, you can have breakout rooms.
Okay, so let me ask you this question, Sarah.
Yeah.
Because this is what I think keeps people from trying these things. Was it perfect the first time you did it? Did every breakout room work out beautifully? Did everybody have a flawless experience the first time that you did that lunch? Or was it a little glitchy? Like, did you have to figure it out, or how did it work?
Kelly, I feel like this is a leading question. No, it was not perfect.
Okay.
It was definitely a little buggy. Like, I, first of all, just had to say to everybody, like, I'm going to hit a button and you're going to disappear. I don't know what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And then I got left out of a room, and I had to like click around to figure out how to get into it. And then I like wound up sort of almost Zoom bombing a group of people who weren't expecting me to show up. You know, there were a handful of things that were not that smooth, and there were some questions like, so how do we know it's over? But people figured it out on the fly, and then we were able to connect afterwards and say, did that feel like it was sort of meeting a need? And if so, do we want to refine it?
And how did everybody feel?
Mostly people liked it. And I think we've only done it once, but what I'll really find out is if more folks want to try it this week.
That's great. But I love the story in that you let yourself do it. It wasn't perfect, because one of the principles that I talk about for reimagining work and life in crisis is it's intention, not perfection. And, you know, you got to just iterate and leverage the learning and keep going. And that's terrific. That's great. So if you had to tell a leader who may be 2 months into this new way of working, if you had to give them 3 pieces of advice for leading a flexible, distributed team in this new evolving normal that's just going to keep evolving, what would you tell them? What were those 3 things you would tell them?
Yeah, it's hard to narrow it down to 3, but
you can do 5. I mean, no constraints.
Well, I think in fact a lot of this applies in any era and in any kind of workplace setup, but it's a matter of being a little bit more intentional, typically when you're not all in person together. So the first thing of any leader is be a good communicator. And when you're distributed, A lot of times that means thinking really intentionally about your message, but also your channels and your cadence. You probably have to communicate a little bit more often, saying the same thing in different ways than you did in person. And you have to think that through beforehand, or you won't communicate enough. And some of that is like in a distributed world, we have a stronger expectation that not everything is synchronous and things are recorded. So people might not come to a meeting where you talk about something important because it's being recorded and they can watch it later and they've got a thing with their kid in the moment, so they're not going to be there, which is fine. But if they don't have time to watch the video later, if they forget, they might miss the important thing. And they're not going to get it when they get back to their desk and somebody is like, oh, did you hear? They might miss the important thing. So you want to make sure that you've got stuff documented in a few places and shared out, probably if it's real important or action you need people to take, in video, in email, in Slack, whatever your tools are. And then you're asking managers to share information out as well in a very intentional way. But I think also, when I say communication, that's what you're saying, but it's also being super careful about your listening, that you are talking with other leaders and finding out what are they hearing from the people and observing on their teams so that you can adjust around that, because you don't see as much if you don't see everybody in person. And sometimes that's good, because sometimes when you're in person, you end up over indexing for something that you can see that might not represent the real array of experiences that people are having. But you have to make sure that you are asking your leaders. And in fact, the example of the Brooklyn lunches is that of my asking the other Brooklyn managers, what are your people experiencing? Does this feel like the thing I'm experiencing? Is that global? So communication, very intentional. That's one kind of a baseline. I think something we've just been talking about, which is that you have to try things. You have to have some hypotheses about things to test and get ideas from other people. So you get buy-in from other people and some agreement on the time frame for which we're going to try something. We're going to assess it and we're going to keep iterating. And that might be a really rapid cycle. It might be, instead of deciding we're going to do the breakout rooms, we're going to decide to try the breakout rooms and we're going to try it twice and see if that's enough data for us to say this is worth continuing for another couple of months, or that didn't feel like it wasn't meeting the need. And that stuff, again, I think that's something you would do in person, but you probably need to be a little bit more intentional about it when you're distributed, and the cycle might be a little more rapid than you're used to.
Okay, interesting.
And then I think also, as we've talked about, the tools, learning the tools that are going to help your organization work most effectively. That's true wherever you are, whether you're in person or distributed. But I think when you're distributed, the lack of the tools becomes really a barrier. And if you can think about putting some things in place and learning how to use them together so that they make you more effective when you're distributed, they're also going to help you when you're in person. So they just give you more flexibility over time. You know, something a lot of people don't know is that when the phone first became available to households, the phone company ran ads that taught people how to use the phone, basically. It was like, the ads would be like a husband and wife, and the wife is really upset because her sister, who lives far away, has written a letter that she's sick. And they talk about that for a while, and then the husband says, you know, we can call her to connect with her. But the idea that you had to teach people to use the tool for how do you communicate, and I think that's just as true today for the tools we have. So even when you decide that your organization decides to adopt some kind of chat, you shouldn't assume that that decision was the important one. The important ones are figuring out how to use it well for your organization and knowing that you have to do some work to get there. And maybe that's consulting people who are comfortable, but also doing some brainstorming and trying yourselves what works for us.
I love that. And, you know, I like that you keep threading this one thing through every answer, which is it's the same whether it's distributed or whether you're in person. And One of the things I loved about your article in Medium, which I think everybody should read, and you have a couple others up there that are very helpful, is you talked about the fact that moving to a distributed or remote team, it actually sets you up to be more productive, more effective. People are more engaged. And my hope is that this forced pilot, which is really what it is that everybody's in,
Yeah.
as we look to the next iteration of this evolving new normal, we keep moving forward and adapting what we're learning in this maybe more remote and distributed reality than what will ultimately be the next iteration. But there will still be an element of that. See this as something that is actually going to benefit your organization ultimately. We're in a crisis right now, so clearly there's some,
Yeah.
definitely issues related to that. But as we move forward, I guess my question is, would you agree that a lot of this ultimately is going to serve the organization and make it more future ready?
Yeah, for sure. I think one of the evolutions we've seen in a short period of time is that on week one, everybody was working from home. And I know a lot of people who are comfortable working from home thought this is the turning point where everybody's going to want to work from home from here on out. And then for the next few weeks, it did not look like that's how this was going to play out, because it took us a while to figure out we're working in a pandemic. That means something very different in terms of what people are able to do physically. They've got kids, or they're not set up to work from home. They don't have the tools, all kinds of things that make it hard. But over time, in the last couple of weeks, what I've started to hear more and more from company leaders is that even though individuals on their teams are finding they may not be as productive because they've got kids or because it's a pandemic, and any number of things fit under that, the teams are actually incredibly productive.
Mm-hmm.
And it's making leaders start to think, oh, we probably need to rethink our work from home policy and our structures for the long run.
Yep.
And I think part of what we're seeing is that there's certain kinds of efficiencies that you get from working from home as teams, and particularly going back to our first idea, as teams start to trust each other more,
Mm-hmm.
they can get more done more rapidly when they don't have to sort of perform trust or perform the things that show, that help you earn trust. If you're just sort of thrown into it, I think a lot of teams are finding that they're getting more done, surprisingly.
Yep.
And it's starting to look like our future might be able to be more distributed and in a way that's a good balance for folks.
Yep. Yep. I agree. Well, Sarah, thank you so much. In addition to your Medium posts, which are just fantastic, is there anything else people should find related to you and your work that you would like them to know about?
I tend to post things that I write about on sarahmilstein.com. So there's usually a little repository there.
Great. Well, I hope people find you there, and also in your 21st user Twitter feed, which is great. I love that. Well, I hope all of you can see now why I had Sarah come and speak to us today. Sarah, thank you. Wonderful wisdom. And I know all these managers are going to appreciate what you have to say. And thank you.
Kelly, thank you so much. This has been a pleasure.
All right. Take care. Thank you. Bye.